Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And with me, as always, is my wingman in everything therapeutic, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm good. Well, actually, in the spirit of congruence, I'm feeling feeling a little low today. Not terribly low, but I'm noticing a little bit of dip in my energy, which I guess we are humans and we do experience times when we are woohoo and times when we are a little so in the interest of transparency, that's where I'm at today. However, super excited, Rory, for episode 96, kicking off with the difference between counselling and psychotherapy, that age-old question. We're going to be discussing that in depth. Going into Practice Matters, something really interesting. You're going to be speaking, Rory, about internal supervisor.
I am. I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the work of the British psychoanalyst Patrick Casement, the man who really talked about supervision. He was the first person who actually kind of talked about supervision. He coined the phrase internal supervisor, and I'm going to share with you how you can use your learning journal or your process notes to help develop that internal supervisor.
Oh, exciting stuff. And of course, Rory, there's going to be a super duper Rory secret sauce handout to go along with that. And we'll get to that in just a few moments when we come to that Practice Matters section. And we're going to be ending episode 96 today, speaking about a skill, a counselling skill, and that is the skill of reflection. I love this. I'm mad on my skills, Rory. So that's put a spark in my eye this morning. And I think the skill of reflection is one of the lost skills. I think it's seldom used, and it is so incredibly powerful. So we're going to be delving deep into reflection. But let's kick off. What is the difference, Rory, between a counsellor and a psychotherapist?
Well, I mean, we've actually talked about this before, Ken. But I think it's well worth revisiting because it comes up time and time again in our Facebook page. And if you're just listening to the podcast for the first time and thinking, what Facebook page is this? If you type in Counselling Tutor, 2 L's, into Facebook, you'll find our wonderful group. It's a closed group. Knock on the door. Over 20,000 people in there now, all studying and interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We've got students, we've got tutors, and also we've got qualified practitioners. It's a really good, rich mix of people talking about counselling, psychotherapy, and psychotherapy training. And this question comes up a lot. What's the difference between a counsellor and a psychotherapist? Well, it's an interesting one. I've heard some people say £40 an hour, which I think is a bit uncharitable. Although psychotherapists do tend to charge more, I have to say, generally speaking. The big difference is, I think, the level in the training. So if you go on a psychotherapy course, and it's usually in modalities such as transactional analysis or Gestalt, some integrative therapies, the arc of training is a lot longer. So you probably do a 2-year diploma, and then you may do a 3-year add-on, which would take you up to level 7, which is the equivalent of a master's degree. So the arc of training's longer. And also in a lot of psychotherapy, they teach diagnosis, which of course in the person-centered world, we don't have. So diagnosing and working with personality disorders, and helping clients who may have more complex mental health issues. So that's my take on it. But it is a longer training. It's 5 years. Our friends at the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy, just down the road from where I live, they run a TA course, and that is for 5 whole years. So 2 years, you qualify with a diploma. So you're qualified, you can go into private practice, and then they top up. It's called a CTA they do, which then allows you to enter the world of transactional analysis psychotherapy. And it's the same with Gestalt as well. So longer training because the theories are more complex. That's the bottom line, Ken. The theories are more complex. Person-centered therapy is a very elegant theory. things like Gestalt and TA, they're very, very theoretically dense. Therefore, the level of the training is a lot longer.
It's interesting, as you say, Rory, a topic that comes up again and again. And I think if we look only a few years back, the line between counsellor and psychotherapist was maybe a little less defined in terms of if you looked to the BACP, they would mention that counsellor, psychotherapist can be used interchangeably, but it seems like it is becoming more defined as we go forward, that it is linked to the modality that you practice. And indeed, I think that you'd be able to help on this, Rory, that if you are a psychotherapist, you can join the BACP. However, if you are a counsellor, you can join the BACP, but there are other organisations that require a psychotherapy qualification for you to be able to join.
Yeah, so you see, this comes down to ethical bodies, doesn't it? So the BACP is probably the most well known. There's the UKCP, and there's also the NCS, the National Counselling Society. The UKCP is the body that oversees psychotherapy, and it's the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapists. The clue is somewhere in the name, I think. So to join that, there is a distinct training path that you have to follow. And interestingly enough, I heard that you can join if you've done a counselling qualification, but it needs to be a certain type of accredited counselling qualification. So their entrance criteria is a lot more stringent in terms of what they accept in training from students. And their whole movement is psychotherapy, which, as I say, one of the things that separates the counselling world from psychotherapy, in my view, is the diagnostic element. That's becoming really, really clear. Diagnosing things like personality disorders, or working with clients who are not worried well, maybe clients who have stepped across that line and become psychotic. Borderline personality disorder would be a classic case, Ken, where someone may be neurotic, which is a very nice phrase, but just worried and anxious, to someone who was disconnected from reality. Psychotherapists are trained to work with people who've crossed over that line. So that's my take on it. And as I say, the training is a lot longer.
And I guess in many ways, a psychotherapist would be more aligned with the medical model, whereas in person-centered and being there and going where the client leads, it is less prescriptive, it is less directive. Psychotherapy may be more directive. Maybe you would be educating the client on the theory that underpins what you're sharing with them. And one of the things that you shared, Rory, that I think back and it makes me smile, is about the bookshelf. If you look at the person-centered bookshelf, the books that have been published on the topic, it would maybe fill a good few shelves. I mean, there's a lot of good books out there, but if you look to transaction analysis, just as an example, there are libraries and libraries of books.
Yes, I mean, you hit on a good point there. The interpretations of theory and the development. TA, I think, has one about 4 schools, 4 different developments from Burns' original school. So yes, it's a developing model where perhaps person-centered isn't the same. And I think the other thing that separates person-centered from maybe psychotherapy is, or counselling from psychotherapy, is Rogers himself, who made that distinction when he worked at the Rochester Children's Home, helping children. That was his first job after he qualified with his PhD from Columbia. And he was the director of that organisation. And it was there that he separated analysis from just listening to people. And I think that's the big distinction. It moves away from the expert telling someone, teaching a model, to the person who's asking someone, tell me about you, tell me what's wrong with you. And I know a lot of psychoanalysts do that, a lot of psychotherapists do that, but in person-centered therapy, that is the whole thing. That's the whole thing. But building the relationship and understanding where someone's coming from. In psychotherapy, there is an element of a taught input, teaching the model. Yeah.
Really interesting. An interesting topic. It does come up again and again, but there is also a counter a counter to this argument, and that is through the eyes of the person that is engaging in therapy, in terms of what is the most successful out of the modalities, Rory. And I know you've got an interesting story of a bird that no longer exists that kind of keys into this.
Yes, I think you're referring to Saul Rosenweg and the dodo bird theory. And Saul Rosenweg was a psychologist who many, many years ago hypothesized that all therapies are equal, and it's the quality of the relationship that actually has the biggest impact on outcomes for clients. And through the years, there's been research on this. It's called the dodo bird conjecture, if you want to Google that. And that's true. And in fact, our friends in the TA world in 2008 took what was called a relational turn, and they developed a new form, a new school, which is I always want to say Häagen-Dazs, but that's
an ice cream.
That's an ice cream, isn't it? Häagen-Dazs. I apologised, but Häagen-Dazs and Sills, who developed what was called relational transactional analysis, which built on the work of, amongst others, Carl Rogers and Patricia Clarkson, and all those who'd gone before, who could see the value of the therapeutic alliance as a curative factor.
Oh, love it. And just before we leave this, I just want to give you a great resource. If you are a member of the Counselling Study resource, Rory did a lecture on comparing and contrasting the different modalities. So, well, if you go to the theory section, there's a lot on transactional analysis and you can dive deeper into that. But if you want to look at the differences between the different modalities, go to the lecture library. If you're a CSR member, click on Study Help. It's under Study Help because it shows you how to compare and contrast the different modalities, which is often asked in assignments. And right there laid out is a beautiful comparison between person-centered therapy, behavioral therapy, and transactional analysis, done with beautiful Venn diagrams. And you can see what is different and what is the same. Because I think if you are a student, maybe done an introduction to counseling, you may be considering what is the right route for you. And it's right that we should be asking these questions. So thank you for that question. Topic that I'm sure we will bring up again and again. It's an evergreen. But moving on to Practice Matters, and Practice Matters an important part of what we do in the Counselling Tutor podcast, because Rory takes an element of practice and discusses it in some depth. And today, Rory, you're going to be looking about that internal supervisor.
I am. I'm going to be talking about someone who's not talked of as much as I think he should be. Patrick Casement, a British psychoanalyst, analyst who really developed the idea of supervision. He wrote a book called On Learning from the Patient, and that book really became the basis of what we know as clinical supervision. And it might be a surprise, but actually supervision is a relatively new idea. Came in the 80s, believe it or not. Before the 80s, in the 70s, I've talked to counsellors who've been around a long time, and they used peer supervision. They just go and hook up with another therapist and chat, talk about the clients. Supervision only became a kind of formal arrangement in the 80s, and it was Patrick Casement and, of course, Shorten Hawkins, who wrote the book Supervision in the Helping Professions, who really conceptualised what supervision is. And I'm going to be discussing why we use learning journals, why we use process notes, and the benefit of those in developing our own internal supervisor.
Practice Matters after this very short message.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
One of the reasons students have a higher supervision ratio than that of qualified colleagues is because at the start of their careers, they need to draw on the experience of their supervisors. Starting out in practice can be a steep learning curve with lots of firsts. The first client, the first ethical dilemma, the first sensation of becoming stuck and feeling out of your depth are all areas where supervision can educate and support. However, there is one area that is implicit in the development of student counsellors, that of developing what is known as the internal supervisor, the ability to take what you have learned in supervision and apply it to self. The term internal supervisor is attributed to British psychoanalyst Patrick Casement, who first coined the phrase in his book, Learning from Our Mistakes. Casement describes internal supervision as an internal dialogue by which the analyst and therapist can monitor moment by moment what is happening in a session and the various options open to them, the various ways they may respond to this, and the implications for the patient in each. In other words, when working with the client, drawing on your process to consider areas such as transference and countertransference. Is this in play in the therapy room? And if so, how do you step out of it and work in the here and now? Boundaries. Is the client pushing boundaries? And if so, how do you address this? Games. Sometimes clients will act out in the therapy room, maybe trying to gain the attention they historically needed from a parent or caregiver. Projective identification. This is where a client may say something about others they really see in themselves. Legal and ethical issues. Areas where you may need to act to stay within the law or ethical boundaries. Self-care. Not to overstretch yourself and make sure you get some me time. And finally, what we learn from our clients. This final point is crucial as it allows you to consider how you best serve the client and tailor your responses to their unique worldview. Developing your internal supervisor is an important personal milestone on the journey of becoming a qualified counsellor.
Thank you as always, Rory. So informative. And you can get Rory's super duper secret sauce handout. And the way you get that is free of charge. You just go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our website. On counsellingtutor.com, right on the top menu bar, just select podcasts. That will give you all of our back catalogue of podcasts, and you want to be navigating your way to episode 96. That's today's episode. On episode 96, you'll find the page, you'll find the player where you can listen to the podcast, and underneath that you'll find the show notes with all the links that we've discussed today. And right there you can download Rory's super duper handout on internal supervision. Of course, if you are already a member of our paid for resource, which is called Counselling Study Resource, then you can log in to your Counselling Study Resource, bob into the handouts vault. All handouts are added there before the podcast even goes live. So it is there waiting for you, searchable for when you need it. But moving away from practice matters onto skills. And today, Rory, you've chose to bring the skill of reflection.
Yes, I think this is a very underused skill. And I always think it gets kind of absorbed into paraphrasing. Reflection and paraphrasing are two different things. And paraphrasing is where you take what the client said, you condense it down and reflect it back. Reflection is how you do that with the emotion that it came with. And I think sometimes that's missed. And reflection can also be very, very useful just to reflect back what you're seeing within the client. So a client may say something, and I say, when you say that, I notice that you smile when you say that. And that is a big part of building the relationship. We talked earlier in the podcast about, building the relationship and the relationship being everything. And reflecting back gently how you see someone, how they are in the therapy room, how you experience them can be just super valuable. And you can do that in a number of ways. You could either reflect back what they've said. It sounds like you're really sad when you tell me this. I sense that you're sad. Or you can actually just reflect how the client is. Sometimes you can say to the client, when you tell me that, you get so passionate about it and you seem to be so involved in what you're saying. That is a beautiful way of building both rapport, which is another skill, and also really reflecting back the emotion and what's really going on in the therapy room between you or from the client to you.
Yeah, one of my personal favorites is reflection, and so often confused with a paraphrase. And the way that I remember it and the picture that I have in my mind that works for me is when you look into a mirror, you see a reflection. You see exactly what goes into the mirror. What goes into the mirror comes out of the mirror in a reflection. Nothing is distorted. Nothing is changed. It is as it is. Now, when we paraphrase, that is our interpretation as the counselor, as the psychotherapist. The client has brought some information. We will take that information, we will process that information, we will paraphrase our understanding. We will tell them back what they have told to us to clarify our understanding. But it is from our process that comes out. A reflection is exactly giving back to the client exactly what they gave to you. And you can say the exact same words that a client gave to you. You can say their words back to them as they said them. And then you hit the nail on the head, Rory, where you're saying you would also reflect back the tone of voice that they said that in, how they were sitting when they said that, were they crossing their arms when they said that, were they holding a part of their body when they said that. But just saying the words back to them, incredibly powerful. And of course, we wouldn't just take the narrative or the story that they're bringing, we would seek out the emotional words, and those are the words that we would reflect back. What happens when you reflect something back is rather interesting, because the client hears their very own words. And so often, if you use this skill effectively, the client will hear their very own words back as if they're hearing them for the very first time. And it's an interesting process because they are their words. Their words come out of their mouth. You hear their what they bring, and then you reflect back just a few words that are the feeling words, and it focuses down onto those feeling words. So often in the narrative, the client may cover lots of different distance in terms of telling a story. And then this happened, and then we went there, and then da-da-da-da. But then he really hurt me. So I went to my dad, and I said to my dad, and da-da-da. And when the client comes to the end, you may reflect back and say, but then he really hurt me. And you focus away from all of the narrative and you bring them down to that pain. He really hurt me. That's the emotion in it. And it's interesting to see the process that happens when a client, when they hear that. It's almost an invitation for them to revisit that emotion and to go deeper. And so often you will see the client go, yeah, he did, because I was feeling like the did, and they will go down into that emotion, which is exactly where we work as therapists rather than just in the story.
Absolutely. If there's one takeaway about the skill of reflection, is that it takes clients into the process, into the work. You can reflect back the narrative, you can paraphrase the narrative, but without the emotion attached to it, all you're doing is having, I think, a conversation. Once you talk about the emotion attached to it, then you drop into a completely different level where the client's experiencing the emotion, maybe meeting the emotion for the first time. And I think that's critical. Some clients don't have an emotional palette. It may be that they come from an upbringing where emotions weren't discussed. So part of that may be for them to be accessing that and putting a name to that emotion for the first time.
Yep.
Particularly good if you're working in child therapy. Sometimes part of being a child therapist is teaching children their emotional palette because they may not have a vocabulary for it. So that can be incredibly useful. And more to the point, it not only shows you're listening, it shows that you care. That's the key thing. It shows that you're really interested in the person and invested in them. That, I think, is one of the most important parts about reflecting.
I couldn't agree more, Rory. It is such a powerful skill, and I've got a resource for you which is free, open to everybody. If you're listening to this podcast, then you have access to this resource, and that is episode 2 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Go back through the back catalogue and go to episode 2 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where we speak about the skill of reflection. And we actually have an example of a simulated skill session where reflection is used. You can hear it actually being used. It's then explained and kind of analysed what that does in the session. And you can go and get that straight away, really. Just go and have a look at that. It's such a powerful skill.
It is. And it's been a really, really in-depth podcast today. We started off with talking about the difference between counselling and psychotherapy, trying to demystify those two words, and we hope we've done that for you. Then I've talked about the internal supervisor and developing that internal supervisor to help you guide your actions with the clients and how to work ethically with the clients and productively. And then we talked about the skill of reflection. So that is the podcast. It's fantastic. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.